Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the early 2000s. Now, you might think you know this era, but stick with me, because it's the period that quietly built the entire economic world we live in today.
So everyone remembers the dot-com crash, right? The bubble bursting, all that chaos. But what's really interesting is what happened right after. It wasn't just about picking up the pieces. Nope. This was a complete rewiring of the global economy.
Yeah, a handful of really powerful forces all came together at once, and they completely rewrote the rules for everyone. They created the very world we're in right now. So, let's break them down.
Okay, first up, the age of consolidation. This is where industries all over the world started merging together, creating these corporate giants, these behemoths with a global reach that was just unprecedented at the time.
Think of it like a bunch of small streams and rivers all flowing into one giant massive river. All these independent companies getting absorbed into these huge corporate oceans. And I mean, we're not just talking about big companies becoming bigger. We're talking about the creation of true global giants.
So you might be wondering, how did this even happen? Well, a big part of the answer is a business structure called the holding company. It's actually a pretty clever setup, pioneered way back in the 60s. It lets one giant corporation buy up and control a whole portfolio of other companies, sometimes even brands that compete with each other, while on the surface, they all still look independent.
And you know, the advertising industry is the perfect poster child for this. Just look at these numbers from the year 2000. You've got just three holding companies controlling over 42% of the entire global advertising market. That's insane. Think about the power that gives them over what we see, what we hear, and what we buy.
And believe me, this wasn't just an advertising thing. Oh no, it was happening everywhere. You look at aerospace, you see European companies merging to create EDS. You look at banking, and boom, 3 Japanese banks joined forces to create Mizuho, which for a moment was the biggest bank on the planet. Even in mining, a huge merger created the world's second-largest gold company. It was happening across the board.
All right, let's move on to the second huge force, disruptive technology. And we're not just talking about, slightly faster computers. We're talking about tech that was a real game changer. The kind of stuff that could create whole new markets literally overnight and make old ones basically obsolete.
Just look at what happened to the movie industry with the DVD. I mean, in 1997, DVDs were nothing, just 1% of studio revenue, a total novelty. But you fast forward just 6 years to 2003, and suddenly they're responsible for 40% of the money coming in. One little plastic disc completely flipped the script for all of Hollywood.
And this tech revolution wasn't just about the technology itself. A lot of it was driven by us. By people just getting sick and tired of the old way of doing things. I mean, think about old school radio, right? Incessant ads, and you'd hear the same 10 songs over and over and over. That frustration created a huge opening for something better.
And the contrast was just stark. It was night and day. You had traditional radio with its tight playlists and constant ad breaks. And then you had these new satellite and internet radio services offering hundreds of channels, way fewer ads, and real choice. For listeners, it was a total no-brainer.
And this wave of tech disruption just kept rolling, hitting pretty much every sector you can think of. In medicine, you had gene-based research completely changing drug discovery. In software, Sun's Java language was becoming the backbone of the internet. And in the world of computing, those giant, expensive mainframes were on their way out, replaced by smaller, cheaper PCs on basically every desk.
Okay, force number 3. This one's a bit different. It's more political. We're talking about a huge global shift towards deregulation and privatization. The basic idea was that governments everywhere started to consciously step back, to open up industries that they had controlled for decades and let the free market take over.
So things that we always thought of as public utilities, the phone company, the post office, were suddenly getting sold off and run by private businesses. The goal, at least on paper, was to inject some competition and make them more efficient. British Telecom is a fantastic example of how this worked. It started its life as part of the government's post office. Then, in the 80s, it was turned into a private company. And finally, by the early 90s, the government sold off all its remaining shares, and BT had to sink or swim in a totally competitive market.
And again, this was happening all over the world. A massive WTO agreement in '97 basically opened up 90% of the global telecom market. Here in the US, the repeal of an old law called Glass-Steagall kicked off a frenzy of bank mergers, creating behemoths like Citigroup. Even something as seemingly straightforward as trucking was totally transformed by deregulation.
And that brings us to our final, and maybe the most important, force of all,
the massive shift in economic gravity towards Asia, and specifically towards China. This wasn't just another trend. This was a fundamental change that was about to redraw the entire economic map of the world.
And look, this wasn't just about China becoming the world's factory. This was about the rise of a gigantic new consumer market. And here's a wild little fact for you that really puts it in perspective. In 2002, China actually surpassed the United States as the world's #1 producer of beer. And most of that wasn't for export. It was for people in China to drink.
The hunger for technology was just off the charts. China's PC market exploded, growing by 50% in just 1 year back in the late 90s. And the forecast for the next few years? An additional 86% jump. I mean, that kind of growth is just absolutely staggering.
And of course, all that growth had this massive ripple effect across the globe. China suddenly became a leading producer and a leading consumer of essential commodities like copper, zinc, and iron ore. Its demand was so huge, it single-handedly drove up the prices of raw materials for everyone else on the planet.
But you know, it wasn't only about China. This was a broader Asian story. You had Japan emerging as a leader in cutting-edge biotech. You had South Korean movies and music starting to capture a global audience for the first time. It was an economic and a cultural transformation happening all at once.
Okay, so after all that, why does any of this matter today? I mean, it was 20 years ago. What does it all mean for us? Right here, right now.
Well, here's the big takeaway. These four massive forces, consolidation, technological disruption, deregulation, and the economic rise of Asia, they didn't happen in isolation. They all converged at the exact same time. And together, they didn't just tweak the system, they built the very framework for the hyper-connected, incredibly competitive, globalized economy that we all now just take for granted.
So it really makes you think, doesn't it? If those were the forces that shaped the world we inherited, what are the forces at play right now, quietly building the world of the future?